I'm Müjdat Çetin. I'd like to welcome you all to today's lecture on augmented and virtual reality. This lecture series is organized by the Gergen Institute for Data Science and River Campus Libraries at the University of Rochester and supported by the National Science Foundation as part of our PhD training program on augmented and virtual reality. Today, we are very pleased to host Dr. Cali Fidopiastis. Cali is a chief scientist for Design Interactive, a woman-owned engineering company. Her expertise is in user-centered iterative design for the development of extended reality training and rehabilitation solutions for medical and military applications. Her published work focuses on topics such as developing new metrics and design guidelines for evaluating the safety, applicability, and usability of the applied extended reality or XR experience. This includes the use of neurosensing tools such as electroencephalography, functional near-infrared imaging, as well as physiological measures and user performance. This last part is extremely relevant for us as we have just completed a course module as part of our PhD training program that was focused on the use of such neurophysiological sensing methods within the context of augmented and virtual reality. With that, we are very excited to have Cali, so let me hand the mic to Cali.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. So I talk with my hands, so if I knock the mic off my or the computer down, just bear with me while we go through. So my title is a little long: User-Centered Design and Metrics for Evaluating Construct Validity and Safety for Enabled XR-Enabled Training and Rehabilitation. And one of the things I wanted to go through is metrics. What's a user-centered design? What does that mean as the outcome of what you're trying to design from the human perspective? But not only that, I wanted to give you an idea of my academic journey and my journey into my current role as a chief scientist. A lot of people think that that's just a big hat that you pull stuff out of, and actually it is. But I had to know a lot of different backgrounds in order to perform my job. And you're going to see part of that in the journey itself. So I didn't want to just be a talk where I spit stuff out at you and you're like, okay, that's this, that's that. We're going to go through it through a storytelling type of methodology. And I think that that will help a little bit with understanding the concepts that I'm trying to relay to you. And then also staying with the concepts of user-centered design, and then also metrics, construct validity, and safety. And sometimes I like to ask questions. I'm not sure if you guys can respond, but construct validity is one of the aspects that I think that many people don't understand when they create virtual environments or XR experiences for operational spaces. Construct validity means that this type of tool that you're developing for that end user actually works in the context of use. And not only does it do that, it does so effectively and efficiently and with safety. So being able to test all that during the design cycle is one of the major criterion for a successful transfer of this type of software into any domain, whether it's military, whether it's educational, or whether it's going to be entertainment. But you yourself as the designer or the creator of these spaces need to have that type of idea in your mind as you're going through and putting these tools together. So let's go on, and part of the talk again, I'm going to sort of meander through my nonlinear path of the opportunities that I was afforded in academia to come to the position that I'm at now. And I'm going to do so through real world application case studies. Now, a case study is going to be one where we're talking about patient populations. We can be talking about training populations, but either way, for patient or training, all of them include a user-centered design cycle. Also, I want you to pay attention to individual differences, not just gender, but whether or not folks have some sort of aspect to their personal self, such as motion sickness history. We're going to talk a little bit as well about cyber sickness and cyber sickness metrics, but couched in adaptation. So adaptation is an outcome of being introduced to some of these technologies, which sometimes don't fit the human. And we need to keep the human as the center of these types of constructs. It's very important to do so, again, for construct validity and safety. We're also going to talk about design guidelines, but I'm going beyond usability. A lot of people who do XR and related fields look at usability as their hallmark for whether or not they have success with a certain tool that they've created. That's not the hallmark. The hallmark is this benchmarking process where you actually are able to tell the end user, hey, this is what's going to happen when you use my system. And these are the outcomes that you're going to be able to expect. So giving them full record of what it is that they should expect when they're using your product. We're going to talk also about user-centered design strategies as a system design process, and then these benchmarking and metrics for construct validity, and then also guidelines for mitigating sickness and adaptation. I'm going to walk through these things from a biological perspective as well. So it's going to be sort of a full talk, but again, I hope it's going to be meaningful to you. So let me start about me. I got my PhD in modeling and simulation at the University of Central Florida, and I was actually one of Dr. Janique Rowland's students. So she brought me in not as a person in optics, I was human factors. And she had me evaluating her prototype head-worn displays for a human perception perspective. She needed to be able to translate her design specs into the human relevance so that we can translate that head-worn display into military applications. And with her, I constructed some of the perceptual user tests that we're going to discuss today. But this was an important event for me because my background is applied cognitive neuroscience. What I did in my bachelor's degree and master's degree was studying brain plasticity. And I was doing so because I was in neuropsych. I was actually had patients who had memory impairment, and I was coming up with different types of strategies for rehabilitation. However, when I was in that field, I was noticing that my tools were not really helpful for recovery. I didn't understand more long-term recovery. How does memory interact with the training that I'm giving? How does this react to real-world life and ecological validity of a training rehabilitation program? And then also it said, what is the base validity for these types of rehabilitation paradigms? Do I have construct validity for my neuropsych test? Yes, I do in clinic applications, but when I'm moving more toward the patient going to home, do I have those? Do I have brain studies that say what I'm doing as an intervention is actually helpful to them when they move to their home environment? And I didn't have any of those tools. So what I decided when I was in my master's degree was that I needed to actually get more experience as a virtual environment designer, and then work with folks to create virtual simulations of patients' homes environments or work environments so that I could match the environment with their brain process and then be able to see how that relevance worked as they translated to quality of life. And this is not an easy task. There were no metrics, there were no tools. And coming into the PhD program in modeling and simulation from an applied neuroscience background, it was quite difficult. But Dr. Rowland took me in and we had a wonderful experience for the 4 years that I was in her PhD program. And you're going to be talking with Dr. Anand Santhanam, who was also from her lab. And we created some very unique products. And I think it's this slide. Which slide are you guys seeing? This one. So I'm moving into virtual rehabilitation. And one of the things that you're going to learn about potentially in the next week's slide pack is biological systems modeling using XR for medical applications. And one of the applications that we did together with Dr. Santhanam is this pneumothorax COPD lung model that was using different types of new animation techniques for breathing in real time. So again, my exposure in my PhD program was varied, but led me again to a more expansive career later. So in my master's, when I was doing my work, I started in biological systems processing, again, toward a recognition for how I was going to do rehabilitation for persons with stroke. My specific work was done in space perception and non-Euclidean brain processing. The image that you're seeing to the right is part of the work that I did as a research in residence in my master's degree at ATR facilities in Japan. I was invited to come to look at biological system motion and a new technique of this type of animation, which looked at biological motion and simulated it as ecologically valid stimuli. So that's a mouthful. And what does that mean? That means that we actually took tennis players who were on the professional circuit at the time. This image is of Pete Sampras here. You can't make him out because he's actually in avatar form. But this was one of the first times that we were looking at how does a computer simulate biological motion, and what are those recognition patterns of certain aspects or cue sets of that biological motion that's relevant to the human. How do we create and construct those so that the simulations that you're seeing actually have the correct visual cues so that you can learn? Now, in this demonstration, I'm not going to actually show you the video of this, but each of these service performances have a little bit different biology difference. But the principal components, when you look at that, is the head, the shoulder, and the arm. When you differentiate those three aspects, you get each of these different services. But can a computer at that time be able to have that level of resolution to be able to facilitate those cues? We were able to show that they do, but in complex environments, we lose and degrade the actual cue set. So we have to understand the integration of the technology that we're using and the limits of that technology against the human's user perception. And this was one of the things that woke me up to say, wow, okay, it's not going to be a direct translation of what we're doing in virtual environments. It's not going to be direct for me to be able to just create a virtual environment. I really have to look at the stimuli that I'm creating. Is it valid for the human to be able to process? And then is it also going to get me the end result that I'm looking for? And in this case, being able to understand what this type of serve is from the perspective of a person on the other side of the net. So this work actually, like I said, allowed me to move forward into virtual rehabilitation and understanding system design from the user-centered perspective. But what Dr. Rowland brought to my table was the benchmarking of the technology. Now, I understood before that the cues potentially are off, but how are they off? Can I measure those before I actually create this environment and send it off to a patient? Yes, you can, but it takes a lot of work. It takes you understanding the technology, how it actually works, how the imagery is projected, how your authoring tool interacts with that imagery, and then how the end user is going to respond to that. So it's a full chain, a full system design specification. We're going to talk next about rehabilitation training, scenario creation, efficacy metrics, and data visualization. I think this is important from the point of view of looking at a prototype and then being able to evaluate that prototype and see whether or not it's going to fit your use case. And in this case, we're going to be talking about this patient. This patient here in this bottom picture with the green room, it has anterograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia occurs where there is either a brain issue, such as like a stroke or some sort of blood response where the patient is devoid of oxygen. This patient had an aneurysm in a particular area of his brain that affected his language and his memory. And in anterograde amnesia, you don't remember things after the accident. So if you remember the movie 50 First Dates, with Drew Barrymore, she had anterograde amnesia. She had a 5-minute memory span, and then her memory is wiped out for the rest of the day. And her husband or boyfriend at the time did all these wonderful things in order to jog her memory of who he was and keep her in the present moment. Well, this patient really couldn't do that either. And when he looked at himself in video, he actually didn't understand who he was. So he kept referring to himself in the third person. And this is going to be very important as we walk through that scenario. So his aspects of his disability did not allow him to learn new environments. So we thought. Okay, so that's a hallmark of anterograde amnesia, is not, again, having memory for the present moment, and then also retaining that memory for the future. So this is his kitchen on the left, and this is a new home. This is a home that he moved into after the accident. He could not learn this kitchen using traditional occupational rehabilitation strategies. What we ended up doing was creating a virtual kitchen, which is what you see in the green room. And he's here with his therapist. And the green kitchen actually is a model of his current kitchen. Now, this patient had what's called anomia or associative anomia, where he did not understand what heating elements were, like the name for them, and then what their use was. So for breakfast, if he wanted to make toast, he would go over here and try to put it in the microwave, or he would turn the burners on because he understood he needed heat, but he didn't know that somewhere in the space was a toaster because he didn't understand where the spatial locations for things were. So when we built this environment, we were able to facilitate his training in a different way. We built a tool. And you're going to see the pre-testing. And again, I want you to pay attention to the metrics that I'm using, because again, this is allowing us to present construct validity for this patient population, but also for the techniques that we're using. This tracker reviewer actually was in his home. So we took 3D scans and we monitored the patient in the home environment. And each of these locations here, his task was to make cereal for his morning breakfast, because that's what he wanted. So you have a certain position, and I didn't mark it with an X, but if you could see my cursor, it's right here. And this is before we did the virtual rehabilitation with him. And if you remember from the previous picture, these are cupboards here. This is a refrigerator. This is his stove area. This is a cabinet where he has the cereal. This is a sink area. This is where his spoons and cups are. And this is a countertop that he could make the cereal in. So as you see here, this pre-testing environment, as I'm doing this tracking of him through the space, he is going everywhere. He's looking up in this cupboard where they keep Halloween decorations. He's going under the sink to look for milk, where the dishwashing soap is. He is going into this cupboard here looking for milk. It's a foraging exploration. He has no targeted goal. He has no targeted behavior here. So he's basically wandering around this environment. Now, after 6 sessions in the virtual space, and again, remember, he's not supposed to be able to quote unquote learn. This is his result. This is in his home environment. So we see now he's got directed behavior. He's also connecting where bowls are, where spoons are, where he needs to be able to make the cereal. So he's making a cognitive map and a cognitive connection to his environment. And this was done through the virtual space that mimicked his environment. But one of the things, again, and I said this before about cues, we assume that everybody can generalize to whatever cues they are having in their environment. This might not be true for your participants or your population of use. You need to understand whether or not they can see the cues and understand those cues, and then integrate those cues into whatever it is that your task performance is. It's not just about what we talk about with affordances. This is not an affordance issue. He could not generalize the items in his space to a general fork or a general spoon. He needed his tools in there. And once we started to put his tools, meaning what he had at his home, in his environment, he started to make the connection to those tools within his environment. So what ended up happening? So we have, again, it's a cereal making task, right? And in his home, we did, and these are in seconds here on this time, So you can see that I have a baseline of time. I'm putting him into a virtual environment here. So this is his pre-test. I also had other folks, his wife who was familiar with the home environment. I had friends who were familiar with the home environment to get an idea, what is this time? What is this pre-time? How much time would it take for a person who knows the home to make breakfast? How much time would it be for somebody who was familiar with the home, and how would they be able to make breakfast, not knowing the layout of the environment? And then putting him into that virtual space, again, with his tools, but this environment that's simulated. We see a peculiar effect here. This is a lot of time he's taking in the first aspect of training. And then on the next day, and the next day, and the next day, to finally where he gets home. This is exciting because it shows that a person with anterograde amnesia unconsciously can learn a particular task, and that they can learn that and keep maintaining that without further training for several months. Now, we weren't able to test this patient in his home environment after 6 months, because his wife decided to move to Canada, where he would get a different level of quality of care. But he maintained this type of behavior, successful behavior in his home environment to 3 to 6 months. So he didn't have to come back in for retraining, or we didn't have to retrain him within his home environment. So this is very exciting, again, because it takes into account the patient and what the patient is supposed to do. And it doesn't force the technology to do anything that it's not supposed to do. So I'm going to talk about the technology in the next example. So here is part of the technology. Let's see if it plays. This environment that you're going to see is another rehabilitation environment. And you can see that this person has a head-worn display on. It's a see-through head-worn display made by Canon. It's mixed reality. So it mixes the virtual and the real world space. He's got a tracker on him, and you can see this mess of cabling. What he's seeing through the headset is this environment here. This is a warehouse. It is a specific warehouse. It was built off of an Army depot here in Orlando, Florida, which is where I'm at. And what the military wanted to know was whether or not we could create and facilitate training for soldiers coming back with multi-trauma, specifically head trauma. Now you could see the different aspects of the environment. I'm going to stop it for a second. You could see that there are issues here with the technology, the way that the technology works. We have some issues with correspondence. We have issues with him overreaching, underreaching, and these could be problematic for the patient. So the task here is a multi-distractor task, and you could see that the forklift came a little bit too close to the individual who was doing the task. The goal here was to see whether or not, number one, can this virtual space facilitate training and have soldiers coming back with multi-trauma be able to go into a job situation? What is their stress level? What is their brain doing as they're actually functioning and doing this task? How many distractors in the environment would they have and then disrupt their performance? So I actually use an EEG, electroencephalography, underneath that headset. I monitored movement, I monitored physiology. So heart rate variability. I looked at stress. I looked at whether or not the brain was functioning okay for that task. The issue with the distractors was interesting because I did it both with patient populations and I did it with persons who were healthy controls. And I noted that in the healthy control condition, those folks were having trouble keeping up with the task, and that the distractors in the environment were even hard for them. One of the participants told me, I can't even be a Walmart greeter with this type of noise and this type of interaction and the speed of response of what the task is about. So what was the task? So let me go back for a second. The task was to be able to take those tools that you saw, take the scanner, and then put them into so organize them and then parse them into their own little groups. So we had paintbrushes, we had cables, all those things that you would have in a warehouse that need to be organized into a closet or a different space. Then in this warehouse, you have noise, you have the fan, you have that forklift that was making the beeping noises. You have to be able to be aware of your surroundings. You have to have situational awareness. Was the participant able to look up during that task? Now the task models what the person's going to do in that environment. So it's going to be a similar reenactment of real-time, real-world task performance. And we still had problems with the healthy controls trying to be able to interact in that type of environment. So what does that tell you? Does that tell you that we constructed the space wrong? No, it tells you that the job is hard, right? It tells you that you're going to have to do a lot in order to construct a space that's going to be available for a person with head trauma to be able to work them into that space. We can't just throw them into that type of job. So the job is difficult, number one. And then number two, that type of work needed to be validated using other tools than just usability. Now, in the other aspect with the patient that we looked at with anterior great amnesia, I gave a simulator sickness questionnaire to that patient. How great was that? He could not remember a single question that I asked him. He couldn't remember the experience. So this simulator sickness questionnaire is a post hoc questionnaire. It's given after the fact. He could not remember anything about his performance and whether or not he was getting sick. I would have had to use different tools, we're going to talk about that as well, in order to evaluate his sickness or whether or not he was having negative adaptation effects. So modern tools that still rely on post hoc or after the effect of the exposure might not be good for your patient population. Your usability might fail in the field because you did not actually account for the user perception capabilities of the end user as they're moving through and utilizing your tool. So be mindful of those things. And again, the complexity of the environment here was one where we had tri-level distractor tasks. So not only did the person have to organize and manipulate those tools in the environment, they also had to be able to monitor whether or not there was an order coming in or whether or not there were other issues in the environment for safety. And we found with the EEG that the person actually responded to predicting when an order was going to come in. They actually predicted 50 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds before I started the printer that was going to alert them that there was an order coming through. This was not true in the patient population. So remember, you have to not just look at the performance of the individual, you have to look at the cognitive functioning, okay? Whether or not you have the right attentional cues in the environment. I would have missed that if I didn't use the electroencephalography. So other types of patients, again, when you're looking at construct validity, and again, this is in the field of use. This patient is a stutterer, a social stutterer. And what we wanted to see was whether or not we can use different aspects of interactors. Interactors are actors that come into the rehabilitation space, and they perform an actor's role. In this case, we had the interactors come in and perform the role of somebody who is a service person in a restaurant. So you have a greeter, you have somebody that is a waitress or a waiter, and the participant has to interact in that environment. And again, this is mixed reality. So we have this environment back here, which is the restaurant. It was actually modeled after a Japanese restaurant here in Orlando. And they have the real world. You see the real world plant right here on the table. This is a real world table. The person's going to come in and sit down. They're geared up with the head-worn display. They're wearing an EEG. I've got psychophysical measures. I have skin conductance. I have a heart monitor here. I also have a breathing, something that measures her breath. So this participant is in full gear and participating in this stuttering exposure. Now, the black bars here, this is from the EEG. So EEG can tell us a lot about attention, a lot about workload of the individual. It also can tell us a little bit about whether or not there's a stress function going on, whether or not the person has anxiety. What I was using it for here was engagement. I was looking to see, is this participant highly engaged in the environment? And again, from a construct perspective, do I have construct validity? Is this environment valid for being able to train persons with social stuttering? The engagement, to be able to measure that, what I had is a baseline. So you're going to see that there's a couple of baselines here because I needed to make sure that the actual, and hopefully I'm not blocking the screen. Let's move you over. That skin conductance is on one side. I have the engagement from the EEG on the other. So the black bars are the EEG. The red is skin conductance. It's measuring the level of negative arousal of the individual. So in my baseline, I've got a couple of them here. So the first baseline is with them without any of the equipment on. And they're exhibiting a little bit of experimenter anxiety, right? So we're looking at the confidence interval, not just at the microsiemens level of the skin conductance response. And then we're looking at the level of the EEG. Now, I'm not quite concerned about the confidence interval of the EEG more than the amplitude shift here. So in my baseline one, no equipment on, just before they start the experiment, we see traditional experimenter anxiety. When we get the into the virtual environment before they're in the exposure, we have another baseline. This is with the technology on. They're just viewing the space through the headset, you know, doing a couple performance things. We start seeing the anxiety going down. But we also see the engagement going up. Now, we didn't tell the participant that what we were going to do was introduce a friendly waiter. They were going to have to do a normal task of ordering food off a menu. And then the order was going to be lost and a rude waiter was going to come in and challenge the participant or the patient to quickly respond and repeat the order that they had given previously. So the friendly waiter comes in, we see engagement increase, which is what you want. Again, construct validity. Should engagement increase while the person's engaged in the task? Yes, it should. Should their anxiety go down as they start to have presence within the environment and then interact normally with the server? Yes, it does. So far, so good. Now what happens? Okay, so we get the rude waiter coming in. They're still engaged. This is a really unique actual result because their engagement stays high in the environment. This is also in the environment here. And again, I'll explain what this baseline is. But the next thing is you see that their anxiety or negative affect is going up, okay? What you don't want in the clinical environment is for a sustained negative response. Your clinician will lose the patient at this point. And this is what we see. We see an escalation. Although the engagement is high, we see an escalation after that negative interaction. So the waiter is pushing for the participant to give the order again. And during that time, we see an increase in stuttering. And we also see an increase in the person's agitation because there's no compassion coming back at them from the waiter. And again, this is by design. We need to see how this environment is working. So we see a sustained response. We see a sustained negative response. And at this point, we lose the patient in therapy. Even though we have good engagement within the environment, we have a negative sustained response. This means that the patient is not listening to the cue. They're not listening to what's happening as far as the rehabilitation or intervention. They're ready to take the headset off and go beat up the waiter, right? And this was across the board. This type of pattern was across the patient population, where we actually saw a negative escalation here during this baseline task. So once we tell them, hey, sorry about the rude waiter, everything's okay, here's a gift certificate for your own restaurant if you want to go to it. We take the equipment off, and as you would expect, the engagement goes down, and so does all of the negativity. So construct validity here was assessed using psychophysical tools and real-time measures. And it was very important for us to do this again from the subtlety of the environment that we were placing the participant in. Also, it helped us understand the safety and the outcomes to the individual. So we can see where we need to be careful at certain points, how we introduce stimuli within the environment. Are they going to be negative toward the individual, or are they going to be facilitatory? Those are things that we have to be able to look at. And then how does the stressor actually have an impact on the individual as they move to their home environment or their environment of use? So again, this is a building on strategy of how you would design and construct a virtual environment, still with patient populations in mind. This next environment, it actually will work. I built at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, and it was for diabetes patients who were coming in and making bad food choices. This model here is of the Piggly Wiggly supermarket. And we actually changed the input device here. So they're seeing through a Vuzix headset, and they're going through and traversing the grocery store on a seated bicycle. And this proved to be very interesting because those participants that went ahead and went through the training using the bicycle versus walking through the store, they actually fared better at their health choices. So changing the input to the system made a huge difference to the behavior of the individual. And then also, again, their outcome and behavior. So the validation here is still of safety. You can see this is obviously a prototype environment. How would this work if this was a screen in front of the person? How would this work if there were other types of tools in the environment? I didn't get that far in this type of study, but it's a different way to show how you would utilize different input. So still, and I don't know where we are in time, but let me go through some aspects of the design now that you've seen the case studies. There are international standards for building human systems, especially when you're dealing with interaction of a system. The key principles here are for you to understand the user, the tasks, and the environments. This is a functional relationship between the user and the technology. It's not a discrete type of thing where you just look at the environment, you just look at the task, you then just look at the technology. No, you have to integrate them into a system and then evaluate them as a system. You need the users involved throughout the design and development cycle. Just as I showed you before, you have to really understand what the limitations are of the participants as they're going through and what you expect the outcome to be. The design is driven and refined by the user-centered evaluation. This process is iterative and it addresses the whole experience. You also need a multidisciplinary design team. You need their skills and their perspectives in here. I couldn't do all of that development myself. I needed folks that understood how to create the environments, the context. I had to understand the head-worn display how those integrated with the human perception. I needed a clinician in the environment. And then I also needed other folks who were able to help facilitate the training over time. So don't look at this as just a single task. This is a group effort, and it's one where there is shared knowledge for how the system outcome should be generated. So what is user-centered design? And we're going to go through these a little quicker. The main question is, what is the purpose of the application? What are the task characteristics? What are the tasks themselves? What level of realism? What type of immersion? Your detail that you're necessary to achieve your outcome effect? How do you meet the application goal? What is the technology? Is a head-worn display necessary, or do you need a tablet? What about the authoring tool? A lot of folks don't factor in the authoring tool. Everybody's trying to get a Unity certificate or Unreal Engine, but that authoring tool interacts with the rest of the technology, and I'll show you how, but it is something to be aware of. Now, the other is the interaction of the end user. Are the motor movements gross or fine? What is the outcome from a perceptual perspective and a cognitive perspective of that end user? We have to look at the holistic aspect and not just one part of the aspect of the end user in the user-centered design aspects. So keeping the user in the loop. What is the purpose of the application? This question drives the overall system design. When you're dealing with human factors, it's a task analysis. You look at what actions are the person's performing. You're looking at what tools are they using. And then in the systems approach, what is that technology that you're integrating? Your context from the CGI perspective and the user are dependent all on each other. And that's what I said previously, but I'm driving it home here. And the other is perceptual performance assessments. Using standardized tests to understand either the limits or the augmentation of the human as we integrate that system. The problems with the current design cycle is that we have lack of standardization. There's not a lot that we can do about head-worn displays and off-the-shelf parameters that are on the box. Most of those are not specific and potentially are incorrect, or they use a design cycle that is just an engineering approach that doesn't look at the full human. So we have a lack of standardization in the technology, and then we have a lack of standardization in the application process of the authoring tool. There's a lot of things that Unity does to color and choosing color that are not conducive to a person in an applied environment. When green needs to be a certain green, Unity will pick whatever is in the gamut palette based on the head-worn display. And it might not even match the color palette of the head-worn display. So we have to be careful about how we're choosing certain tools, again, contextualized environments. How do you then assess that technology, the techniques that you're using for CGI, and the user dependence? You do need this user iterative approach. And Dr. Roland and I came up with a perceptual performance assessment that uses standardized tests. We're going to go through some of those things. There's also usability engineer protocol that looks at the task analysis, and then expert and user assessment. These are action-based protocols. They don't just have aesthetics in mind. A 3D environment is an interactive environment, so you need to be sure to be able to include that within your design feature. And then there's an overall evaluation. And some of these references that I have here are historical. And it's because we seem to think that the past isn't relevant in academia. We say, okay, we'll use the last 10 years of results. Well, in the last 10 years, we potentially have forgotten about different aspects of the past that have evaluated these environments previously and that their outcomes still hold. And one of those is the Virtual Environments Performance Assessment Test Battery by Lampton et al., 1994. Their capability of assessing the user in space while they're moving, while they're interacting with objects, is an add-on to the usability engineering protocol. And we have to be mindful that the past doesn't always actually mean obsolete. There are protocols that can be utilized today, but we have forgotten them. So hopefully some of you will go back and take a look at those papers from these time periods and reevaluate how you're approaching system design. So this is a combined challenge. Cyber sickness is still with us, regardless if it's augmented reality. Head-worn displays still have eye strain. It's even more prevalent now than it was previously. We also have individual differences issues. And a lot of folks point to gender and age. However, I'm going to argue that that's potentially a technology issue and not so much an individual difference. There's also adaptation effects. And Dr. Rowland was one to facilitate an idea of what augmented reality imparts to an end user, because the misconception is that augmented reality will have less sickness than or adaptation effects than virtual reality. That frankly is not true. It's more subtle, but it is there. There are also other perceptual issues that we see, visual errors, acoustical distortion. All of those are still with us and provide challenges as we create designs for XR applications. We need to be very mindful of those in the design process. So cyber sickness, how big a problem is this? This is very big. 50 to 95% people are susceptible to this type of sickness. They can have visual flashbacks, most of them in the ocular disturbances. They can also have disorientation. And this is another reason why I took the approach that I did with patient populations. Because as we saw with the patient with anterior grade amnesia, they're not going to be able to tell me that they're sick. They're not going to be able to use a questionnaire. They're not going to be able to actually give me a verbal report. Unless they're vomiting, I wouldn't know. If their spouse reported excessive sleepiness, I wouldn't know. Nausea, he didn't have connection to himself in that manner. So these are very important aspects to be mindful of, that people are susceptible to sickness. And it doesn't matter whether you're in VR or you're in AR or you're in a mixed reality environment, you're still susceptible. And what's the problem with VR? This is the sensory input issues. And we see that there is a vestibular issue, visual issue, and proprioceptive issue. And we have system imperfections. People thought that it was going to be, hey, let's just build better technology and we'll get rid of all this stuff. Well, that doesn't happen. Right? Again, it's because of this interaction of the end user with these types of tools, the authoring tool and the head-worn display, and that it's still a level that does not match human perception. The integration of these sensory inputs alter vergence and accommodation of the eyes, your vestibular conflict with your head movement, and your somatosensory conflict. When you're actually doing motor command and reaching. So these symptoms of VR exposure, and I'm going to argue that VR exposure is different than AR exposure. We see that because, again, this type of effect on the end user leads to postural instability, altered vestibular ocular reflex, hand-eye coordination, and general malaise. And again, that's a function of the interaction of the technology not quite suited to the perceptual capability of the end user. But it's also taken, and again, this is Dr. Kay Stanny. We lost Dr. Robert Kennedy last year, a very sad loss to the research community in cyber sickness. Over 3,000 participants, they evaluated over a 10-year period. They have over 11 peer-reviewed publications on the topic of cyber sickness. But the point here, and I have this here as, sorry, I'm like going to, descriptive. This is just descriptive. It doesn't really come to an idea about what is the underlying cause and mechanism of sickness. There are many general theories, individual differences, underlying mechanisms of the technology. We can pre-select users. How do we assess the user for exposure and mitigation? The simulator sickness questionnaire is a self-report. It's been around again since the 1990s, and it's still one of the ones used to look at simulator sickness. Other folks are coming up with predictive cyber sickness and indices using psychophysical measures. However, those are not as accurate per individual. And again, if I were using this type of report on a patient, it might not come out to be valid anyway. The simulator sickness questionnaire, and I have the first application of this, which is 1993, it has a symptom profile. These are biological mechanisms here. These are pointing to biological mechanisms. They're still descriptive. You have nausea, gastrointestinal distress, stomach awareness, salivation, you can have burping, ocular motor, eye strain, difficulty focusing, blurred vision, headaches, disorientation, vestibular responses such as dizziness and vertigo, and then an overall sickness score, which is a compilation of each of these. Nausea, ocular motor, disorientation, all of these point to human biological systems that we still haven't pinpointed which one of those interactive mechanisms are causing this type of sickness. The profile for sickness is different depending on what type of sickness you're talking about. So we need to be mindful of that as well. When you're in a virtual environment, and this is specifically for VR, sickness profile, you typically have disorientation as your first. Your nausea is next, and then your ocular motor. In space sickness, again, those guys going up in a spaceship, it's ocular motor with disorientation and then nausea. Simulator sickness is different. It has an ocular motor with a nausea and a disorientation profile. Seasickness is even more different. It's got the nausea first with disorientation and then ocular. When we're evaluating a head-worn display system or any display system, we need to be mindful that one of these or another might be dominant based on how we've constructed the space and how the user is performing in that space. In augmented reality, I'm seeing a little bit more between simulator and space sickness. Ocular dominance here is the ocular motor is the dominant feature of AR. So that's different than the VR profile. So we need to be able to understand, again, the categorization here, minimal symptoms, if I'm rating 5 to 10, significant symptoms, 10 to 15, and then so on. So this allows me to actually be able to say, what level of sickness am I experiencing? And do I have a problem that I need to rectify, either by choosing a different display or a different way that I've created the context? But this type of profile is something to pay attention to. Now, again, there's risks here that we've seen, exposure time over 20 minutes. Those environments created without user control or world guidance. Scene complexity can contribute all the way up to vomiting. There's also been a gender issue. People have said that females have a higher level of post-sickness or ocular motor with disorientation. They could have higher ratings of motion sickness. And then also the BMI showing less sickness. So some of the guidelines: keep the exposure less than 15 minutes, reduce the user's degree of freedom in their movement control. When using visually specified accelerations, you need to correlate that to body forces to give a level of realism. And then use different tests like the motion history questionnaire as a pre-screening. And females with low body mass index should be warned of sickness. Again, looking at a gender issue. Some of the design features here, using peripheral blur. This is still going after certain aspects of how we think or what we think the underlying mechanisms are of sickness without actually understanding what the mechanisms are. Posture maintenance techniques. Here, physical leading indicator, active viewpoint control. Rest frame designs, being able to have a person be able to move their eyes to a different location within the scene so that they could actually give their eyes a rest from continually looking. And then the guideline principles of looking at the root cause. And we see again the base, disorientation, ocular motor, and nausea from these other types of constraints, human physical, motion parameters, content parameters, and the visual constraints. However, I challenged our team to take a look at the female aspect and individual differences. Because one of the things that Dr. Rowland and I noticed is that many folks, when they're designing head-worn displays, are not doing the intrapupillary eye distance well. And what we found is that in the study here, and I gave that as a paper for you guys to read, is that most head-worn displays on the market at the time that I did this study actually don't fit women. 90% of the people who use Oculus Go do not fit that head-worn display on the parameter of intrapupillary eye distance, which means that the head-worn display isn't set for them specifically of where their eyes are pointed or where their eye points are, and where the eye point are going to be converging on the virtual plane. This causes a big problem. This is going to be something that is going to cause sickness because your eyes are not focusing appropriately, nor are they adapting correctly. So there's not very many of the headsets. You see 40% of the females can't fit the HTC Vive Pro. This was an important result because it's not a gender issue, it's a technology issue. So what I did is I expanded the study. I said, okay, if this is a true gender issue, then males who don't fit the head-worn display shouldn't get sick either. But actually they do. Males who do not fit the IPD of the head-worn display get sick at an equal proportion than those females that do as well. So it's a technology issue. You definitely need to make sure the individual differences of the persons that you're using or the population of use are matching the technology space. If not, you're going to end up with some issues that are not rectifiable. Some of these head-worn displays, like the Oculus Go, have a fixed 63.5 millimeter IPD. So they're not adjustable. They will not fit 90% of the folks, and I have their IPD ranges here. So it's going to be, does this technology fit my operational use? And is it going to facilitate the action space that I'm in? And again, these are all things that we need to be able to be aware of as we're in the design process. So this design is an integrated problem. The display device can have all these types of issues where there's depth distortion, blurry resolution, brightness limitations. Those are going to lead to the optics, or not the optics, but the context projection being cluttered, or the colors being limited in range, or the environmental conditions not being appropriate for use within that operational space. These are going to lead to perceptual issues. So all of these are for head-worn display, mobile, or projected systems. And this is an integrated problem that has to be assessed. The head-worn display design technology is a technology-centered approach. When they design a head-worn display, it's the technology that they look at. Each one of those head-worn displays have a particular function, and it's designed with that function in mind. So for example, if it's for a certain shooter game, it's going to be designed to maximize or optimize that shooter game. The design decisions and content and action scenario follow, and then the user is brought in to evaluate the performance aspect. This is not the right way to go. Okay, there are many limitations. What are we missing? The human eye. Many of the head-worn display developers just stay at the eye level. But as you see, the eye is connected to the brain. Here is the binocular fields, the visual field of the right, the visual field of the left, and they overlap. But what happens to the brain? What's on the left becomes on the right, what's on the right becomes on the left, and then we actually have the primary visual cortex responding and then processing and moving that information to like areas of the parietal lobe where we have object recognition. So it's not just the eye that needs to be represented in head-worn display design and development. It's the whole brain. And I'm going to show you some results from this, and I know we're running out of time here, but I wanted to be able to show you how to be able to use some of these new tools. And I used functional near-infrared imaging in augmented reality. And this monitors hemodynamic changes in the near-infrared range of light. And we can cover multiple sources. This is a very archaic tool. The current use of this tool based on our prototype designs, helped Neurix design a new type of head-worn display that can be worn like an EEG cap. I'm not going to really explain the process here, but basically you have the near infrared light that comes in and it goes several millimeters into the gray matter and then has a detector that comes here. And then you're able to get and generate a 3D image with a, where the most activation is being visualized. And this only goes 2 to 4 millimeters into the cortex. However, it gives us a little bit more idea about how the brain is processing the information. It's also giving us temporal on milliseconds to a minute. It's okay in resolution there. That's why I combine it with the EEG, which gives me a little bit more fast time. So this archaic thing we used, again, these are the optodes, and this is an expert Marine who's performing an object recognition task with 3D models and seeing whether or not these 3D models facilitate training of recognition of military tanks. We only had an N of 4. This is, again, something to be mindful of. When you're doing exploratory, your exploratory pilot should always precede your deductive research design. Exploratory means just that. I'm taking folks and I'm exploring whether or not this type of tool works or whether or not the construct of the environment works. And one of the tasks here is the training. You can see the black and white photos here. This is how the training is done typically, where you're recognizing differences using just the line drawings. And is this going to be different if you've seen a 3D model of those same tanks? Well, this is the data. This is your expert. And you can see here, and what I did is I looked at the right parietal lobe. And again, this is where persons are integrating the components of the object that they're seeing and then responding whether or not they've seen what they thought that they saw. So the experts actually have high activation in the parietal lobe compared to the novices, which have spread activation. The percent correct that the novices had was approaching after training what the experts had, but we could definitely see that they weren't functioning the same way from a brain perspective as the experts were. And because we have the brain modulation here in the graphical display, I can start monitoring how this brain area is going to change through training. Again, an aspect of construct validity and safety. I can also see where does the brain flip over and actually start looking like the expert, and then be able to corroborate that with the actual performance of the task. So we're going to skip through some of this. This is about the head-worn display, but I wanted to get you to the psychophysical tests. One of the things that we want to understand is how does that head-worn display interact with the end user, and what perceptual issues are they going to have? I noted that before with the environmental scene clutter, your color fidelity, depth perception cues, all of those can be off because of the way that the head-worn display is designed. We're looking at the human perceptual issues, and I connected those with psychophysical tests. You can do visibility, depth ordering, and scene distortions using perceptual matching for depth judgment. You can also look at visibility and color misperception using the Farnsworth-Munsell test color arrangement task. And then the depth distortion and object segmentation. All of these tests have been integrated into one of the test batteries that Dr. Rowland and I came up with in 2005, 2006. One of the papers that I had you read is from 2010, which is the integration of these for patient populations and using this test battery in order to evaluate a virtual environment. So resolution visual acuity, ability to see and resolve fine detail, dynamic visual acuity, this is not part of the test battery yet. I'm adding that currently. Contrast sensitivity, mapping the perceived contrast as a function of the spatial frequency of your eye channels, depth perception, the ability to judge distances of objects in the virtual environment without confounding object size or occlusion, and it lends to the 3D perception, and then also color matching. So what about the parameters of the head-worn display, right? So we have resolution. This is comparable to the resolution of the eye. We have image focus, again, comparable to the stereopsis. Contrast, we have different aspects of how these types of parameters will affect how the person will view the environment. Now, if I just take the specifications here and just do some calculations, we see that the Microsoft HoloLens has about a 2.9 arc minute for resolution visual acuity as compared to the human. And comparing that to the human, which is 1 arc minute, we see that this is not as good, right? It's about 20/60. So from a Snellen perspective, this is the type of chart that you would see if you were doing an eye test. So somebody who is at 20 feet will see perfectly, and what you are seeing is at 60 feet away. So you're not as good as somebody with a 20/20 vision. And you're even worse if you're using a different type of headset. And here the Air. I put this one in here, and again, I'm going kind of fast, so I'll take questions after, but it's 4.7 arc minutes. And this is no longer on the market. This is no longer on the market. You could see that we have comparable parameters, but this did not make the cut. And there's a reason why. It didn't fit the market space. These types of parameters from the user's perspective didn't meet the market space. And you would have been able to tell that as an engineer if you looked at the task. What does the task need? What's the minimal resolution that I need to actually have accurate task performance? And it's not 4.7. So we see that we have a limitation based on the cone receptors in the eye, and that comes out to be about 1 arc minute of this resolution visual acuity. That's what limits your ability to see fine detail in just regular life. The limit of that is the pixel size of the microdisplay as it's projected by the microdisplay. So how do we evaluate that? We used what's called the computerized Landolt-C. And this measured visual acuity by taking the left and right eyes and overlapping them, and then looking at the gap size differences here. So those would rotate in space. And then what you would see is that a monitor would give you the right arc minutes for the human. The Snellen conversions are here. And then the augmented reality system that we evaluated started at 4.1 arc minutes. And that was, again, based on the projected size of the pixel. And then we just went ahead and used these sizes to test to see where is the limit of that display given different contrast, and then given different ways of viewing that within the cluttered environment. The next in measuring stereopsis, this is pretty interesting because again, it depends on the interpupillary eye distance. And this is one reason why I was harping on that parameter previously, is that it actually helps facilitate stereo acuity. So the depth perception or perception in 3 dimensions. And what we did is we took the Howard Dolman apparatus, and this is a pretty fun archaic device that still works. You have the 2 columns here, and you've taken away any depth cues. And the person has to sit 6 feet away and then align these columns. One will stay straight in the same place, it's your referent, and then this one will move. So you have a moving object on either the left or the right. And Dr. Rowland was pretty smart. She said, okay, I need to figure out what types of display parameters I need for these objects. So I'm going to figure out through a psychometric testing what these objects need to look like. And she figured out that a column and this octahedron shape here was the best one to use. So we did that and used that in the study where we projected the referent onto the depth plane. Like, where is the sweet spot of that headset? And then we moved the octahedron either in front of the plane or behind the plane and said, okay, what's your depth perception in front of the plane? Because obviously at the plane, you should see pretty good stereo acuity or whatever the acuity depth of focus is of that head-worn display. And we utilize that for some of her prototype systems. And again, this might not be meaningful to you, but setting the depth plane at 800 or 0.8 meters, 1.5 meters, and 3 meters, the head-worn displays were optimized for 3 meters, which in their optics is optical infinity. You can see here that we don't attain, which is between 20 and 40 arc seconds, the human's ability to do stereo acuity. And we start to fall off even more if the system is not optimized correctly. So these systems are optimized for 3 meters, and they're actually doing pretty well, except for the HMPD2. But this was optimized for each of the depth planes, and we see that it actually maintains this optimization across each of the depth planes. So that's a good result, but it's not great. It needs to be improved a little bit. And again, in this prototype phase, this is where you want to do the improvements. If we know we need to get to 40 arc seconds, you know that where you need to go now in the iterative process. So we can do this across many different head-worn displays. Some of these are the old systems. This is a projection display. The Canon is the mixed reality display that I use. VR6 is no longer on the market, but it's a full virtual reality headset. And the HMPD2 is the newer model of the headset, again, going through an iterative design cycle. But you don't want to just look at the technology. You have to look at human performance. So when we did this test, we actually created a human performance aspect where we're looking at whether or not the object is either in front of or behind that projected depth plane. And we can see here that it only is above chance for one of the types of headsets. All the other headsets are just approximating, and some are very terrible. So although you can see with high resolution at the depth plane, you really are not functional in utilizing that head-worn display. Now, this is the headset that I had the patients using. And if you remember from the video that I showed, the person was having trouble grabbing stuff. And the reason for that was because they had an offset in depth. And that offset was causing them to have more problems. I actually had to keep them a little bit after they're using that headset because of a little bit of an adaptation effect. The other is color perception and color matching. This is the HTC Vive. Now, if I were looking at a normal human color here, this would be a circle around these, not these broad swath across the X and Y. Sorry, the X and Y, from the green to the yellow and the red to the blue, I think. No, this is red to green, and this is yellow to blue. So we can see that the colors chosen based on the CIE labs, and again, this is just a color reference using the color itself, the intensity of the color, and then changing that based on the head-worn display, what the head-worn display is choosing for that color to be. It limits the color palette, and it may shift the colors away from their real chroma in the real world. And that is where the interaction of the headset comes in with the authoring tools I was saying before.
Just to let you know, we are almost running out of time.
Excellent. This is the last slide. And then,
okay.
And so I'm just going to leave you with ideas of, again, my career starts as a graduate student who's understanding brain trauma. And then I move into creating these systems for rehabilitation and military applications and trying to understand the user-centered design process. And in so doing, I have to understand the context, the action space. I have to look at cognition and human perception throughout the design process. But that took building a lot of tools. It also had to understand metrics and different ways of employing those metrics on looking at the system components and how they support the task, and how the safety aspect of those combined system components respond to the human. And then also, can I measure that construct validity before I push the final product to the field? Also, I didn't realize that I was going to have an interaction between the authoring tool and the computer graphics techniques with the individual differences and the interaction with the head-worn display. So we need to make sure that we're accounting for that. and then following that design process through, not just testing it in your lab, but bringing it to the environment of use, and then allowing the participants to provide you feedback before you get to the end result. So again, I had to learn a lot before I could get to the position that I'm in. So I'm encouraging you to make sure that you take a look around and not just say, okay, I'm going to be a specialist in usability. I'm going to be a specialist in, Unity creating context, right? Look at it all and then pick your niche from there, but have a good global understanding as a team member that you're going to have when you go ahead and create these new environments, especially when you're dealing with operational spaces that include specific participants like people with disabilities or persons with head trauma. So with that, I'm sorry I took up all that time and talked all the way through, but if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And then this is my contact information if you want to have more discussions offline.
Thank you, Kelly. These are excellent points. So we almost ran out of time, and I think a few people started leaving. So if you have to go, you're welcome to leave. But if you have time and have questions, please ask. So the floor is open for questions.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. So I guess my question is twofold, and mostly I guess it's also relevant to the last slide that you presented. So I was wondering, so what are the sample sizes when designing, when developing applications for clinical populations? Do they usually start as case studies and then maybe the application is validated on larger sample sizes? And then for the second part of the question, what are the steps that need to be taken for such an application, which is born basically in the lab and in a research environment, to be to see that being actually used in a rehabilitation clinic by clinicians, for example? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so those are wonderful questions. So let's go back to, sorry, we're gonna go through all the slides here. So let me answer your question with this here. And let me move this out of your way. So to answer your question, so the first is when I'm doing a prototype, I bring in patients. In this case, I started with 2 patients, and I look to see what my profile is going to be. So again, from an exploratory perspective, I need to understand what are my sort of patterns that I'm going to see in the data. So I'm looking for a pattern of, in the engagement part, they should be engaged in the application, right? But I was not expecting the negative affect aspect at all. And so I needed, once I saw it in the one patient, I needed to see if it was supported in other patients. So we tested up to about 8 participants before we saw that this was a repeated pattern, that once we stressed them out here with the rude waiter, we were getting this sort of after effect response. And again, you know, from a clinical perspective, we have to decide if this is going to be clinically relevant. Is this going to impact the participant negatively? And it does affect training. It does affect their therapy. So that's where we were saying, okay, now we've got to back this down. We can't come at them too aggressive, and we've got to change the protocol for how we interact with the patient, right? Because we want to keep them engaged, but we also need to look at how we're going to decrease the behavior. And in this case, the social stuttering. It's not about stressing them out to the point where they, you know, they have post-traumatic stress. So that was one aspect. And in your second question, what we're able to do once we start doing that, and from a point of view of FDA, so the federal groups that monitor these things, sometimes when you're making clinical claims, the FDA will require you to go through an FDA protocol procedure to get it approved as an FDA device. And this has been problematic. This is something that I have been looking at for many years because it takes at least 6 years to get through that FDA process. So if you're trying to create these tools, and you'll see that across the board with different AR devices and apps for health, they say this isn't a clinical tool. If it is a clinical tool, it has to go through different accreditation processes or quality assurance and safety assurances that could be 6 or 7 years in the making. So those are types of things that we need to work on as a community to inform the governing bodies about how they need to treat these types of tools. Now, how would I go about pulling these types of tools into and have them be an accepted rehabilitation protocol? I would actually do what I'm doing here. I'm going to show that they physiologically have an effect on the end user that's positive, and that they support and augment the training that they're doing. And it has value added as an addition to their training. And then, but as I did with the participant with anterograde amnesia, I'm going to demonstrate that in the field. I'm not going to do it in the laboratory. I'm going to facilitate it here, bring the patients in, allow them to be able to give me these types of metrics, and then I'm going to evolve the process and then take it into the clinic. And again, you don't need high end sizes for those either. Those are going to be something that you can have an N of 8 for in the clinic to show efficacy, and then be able to start moving it to cross-validation. And cross-validation means that it's not just in one environment. So Dr. Skip Rizzo is at the University of Southern California, USC, and he is the head of the CREATE Institute there. And he has a post-traumatic stress virtual rehabilitation trainer that he has been validating for probably the past 10 years. And he's getting it now just through FDA approval in a cross-validated site in hospital rehabilitation training setup. And this is with hundreds of patients. So these are the types of things that you have to think about as you move through. And I hope that that was complete in answering the question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. And there's a question in the chat from Maya. Maya, do you want to unmute and ask yourself, or should I read it? I don't see you unmuted, so I'll ask. So the question is, well, it says, so thank you for the amazing talk. Do you think symptoms like dry eyes, eye tiredness, nebulous symptoms associated with eye fatigue are related to motion sickness with AR?
So if you're saying that it's a precondition, it potentially can. I mean, the one thing about blinking and the other things about actually not being able to wear your eyeglasses and stuff mean that you're going to be out of your norm of how you're using your eye within the space. And that type of eye dryness, those types of things, I don't think that they strictly contribute to the feelings of cyber sickness, but they do contribute to visual fatigue. So the visual fatigue aspect, and this is also the case with different types and styles of the way that the pixels are oriented. So an AMOLED has a different level of projecting the blue pixels, and those can cause more fatigue, and so that will interact with the dry eyes, and that will interact with different eye conditions that you have. But it won't contribute to leading to cyber sickness. That is a different pathway. When you start doing an adaptation effect, and that adaptation effect is perturbing your biology, that's when you start feeling, I'm out of sorts, I'm not well in this, I'm going to start looking at it as something that I need to mitigate, but your body will respond to it first. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Kelly. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, hi, Jeremy Goodsell. Thanks for the talk. I also work with Dr. Hololens, so it's good to hear from another person who worked with her. I had a question regarding something I've been interested in. Took a class on vision. We learned about color perception. And so for these displays where, like especially optical see-through, where you have to balance the display color from like the color of the display versus a dynamic background that's changing a lot. I wonder if you've looked much into how that affects perception and usability.
Yeah, so actually I'm going to show you something here. And this was one of the papers. Sorry, I can't get out of this. So I'm probably giving you sickness. Oh, we did get out of it. So this here is an example of your brain creating a solid entity where there is none. And what we're finding as you're talking about the differences in color, and you can see the differences in color here and how they perform in a color spreading manner to create a solid object, you end up starting to get aspects of visual illusions. And these actually can impact and harm the end user. So if I have a color that is not quite appropriate for its background, it looks like it's presented in depth in a certain way. And if it actually has motion in the background of it, it can create illusory objects. So you end up with a under the level of consciousness effect of potentially seeing stuff that are not there, almost like a Necker cube. And that causes some aspects of adaptation that are negative as well. Because again, there's a fast-acting eye system and there's a slow-acting adaptation system that's more cognitive in nature. And those interact. So the color gamut is very important, and how that color gamut interacts with the context could facilitate these illusory responses. That's one. The other is that we're noticing the color smear. And that is affecting how the end user sees the geometry of the space. So if they are moving in one direction and the background moves in another, given the color, they get a motion artifact or a vection. So those are other types of interactions with the human system that are color mediated. Does that answer some of your questions? I don't have specific examples. I would have to understand what system is that you're using and how you're projecting the background and the color to give you more specifics.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a good start. Opens up more questions.
Yeah, and that's the part, you know, we continue as I've been going through showing you the past to the present. Because the past is still relevant to the present. And a lot of this work has been done in the early 90s and some in the later 2000s, and they're still relevant from the perspective of how user comfort, wearability, and again, the adaptation response to the end user.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I see another question in the chat from Victoria. Victoria, do you want to unmute and ask yourself? It seems not, so I'll read Victoria's question. So this talk enhanced my learning curve and piqued my interest, so thank you. Also, thank you for addressing the gendered component of engineering and design and technology. This is very important. This is very, very important. Would ambulatory or other physicians find these tools as possible referral for various neurological conditions and those associated with aging, i.e. Parkinson's, age onset dementia, Alzheimer's, etc.?
Yes, I think, so the work that I started in was in, as I was talking about in the beginning, is space, and spatial neglect was one of them. And again, this is parietal lobe mediated injury to the brain, and it distorts space. Could we use virtual environments to help in a treatment protocol? This extends to some of the states that you were talking about as well. The issue that we have is, again, making sure that the context is going to be appropriate for that use and outcome. Maureen Holden at Northeastern has been one of the ones that has been using virtual technologies to help with persons with Alzheimer's and persons with Parkinson's. And she had a mailbox application to where the patient actually had to take the virtual letter and be able to place it into the mailbox. Again, you could see that this simple response has a lot of technological components to it, and you have to do a lot of measurement for it. So yes, there are application to these types of cognitive deficits, but we also have to make sure, again, that we're going through the right process of evaluating the tools and techniques and what we think the end product is going to be. And this is where I've been using the EEG and the near infrared to take a look at what that brain pathway is doing. Again, I'm not getting that far into the white matter track and seeing white matter track changes, but definitely seeing that gray matter track change. And that would be part of the construct validity for any of those types of applications in the fields of use that you're talking about.
Cali, is there one last question? We are seriously over time, but if there's a burning question, we'll take it. If not, let's thank the speaker again. Cali, thank you so much for sharing all your experience and all this technical knowledge with us. This is amazingly important for our students. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. If you have questions, email me. Bye-bye.
Bye.